Hello everybody and welcome to this trial live episode. My name is Philippe Ozil. I'm a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and today I'm going to be talking about code coverage and how you can use it to drive your testing strategy. Before I start in the presentation, I'd like to remind you that we are a publicly traded company, so please make your purchasing decisions based on what is commercially available in the product. I am going to talk about some features that are not GA, so bear in mind that you should not buy the product with the assumption that they will make it. So here's our agenda for the day. We're going to be talking about code coverage, of course, and I want to make sure I introduce this concept first. I'm going to take the standpoint of any technology, not just specifically Salesforce. And then I'm going to be jumping extensively on the tooling and best practices. These two sections are going to be intertwined basically because I'm going to be presenting the tools and some of the best practices to use those tools. Now, this is going to be focusing on Lightning Web Components and Apex. All right, let's get started. So first of all, what is code coverage? Well, code coverage is a measure, it's a percentage actually, that describes how much of your code is tested. And the way you calculate this is pretty simple. It's the number of executed lines that are being tested in your code divided by the total number of lines in your code. Of course, that's times 100 because it's a percentage. Now, what is interesting with this specific measure is that it is something that lets you also find untested code. So besides the percentage, you can also isolate and identify parts of your code which are not tested. So these two things are to keep in mind, the percentage and the detection of untested code. So let's take an example. Here I've written a very simple function. This is nothing, of course, that you would really have in production, but what is interesting here is to see how with two different tests we can reach 100% code coverage. So for now, in the current state, without running the test cases, we have 0% code coverage. If we execute test 1 with value a equals 1 and b equals 2, we'll cover half of the lines. So this means we basically have 50% code coverage. So you can see here in pink the lines that are affected by these two specific values in this first test case. And if we run a second test case with b a equal 3 and b equals -5, we would execute the other 50% of the code. So that reaches 100% code coverage with two test cases. Of course, this is a very simple scenario. There are only two possible branches of execution with the test, but you get the point. The idea is to stack the different tests and to make sure that these different tests use different values and take different branches in our code execution. Now, this is something I did for the sake of the demo. Of course, there is tooling that helps you identify all of that. And let me jump to tooling now. Before I do that, let me just remind you that code coverage, it's very powerful, but it's also a measure of quantity. It's not a measure of quality. Again, if you did not if you could have 3 different tests to cover those lines in this specific sample here, but you wouldn't need that. The idea is that you should write just the right amount of tests to test the content. And code coverage doesn't really take care of, code coverage doesn't really analyze the quality of your tests. It's just a matter of volume, but doesn't describe whether you're using the right values or whether you should do specific things to make sure you target specific lines. Now, I'm going to be talking about tooling. And for tooling, I've basically sorted all the different tools in 3 levels, I would say, going from the lowest, which is the bare minimum, up to the smart approach, and then the long-term vision. So basically you want to be at level 3 and have everything, ideally. Now, let me just go over those different levels, starting with the minimum. Now, for the minimum, you have everything available with the command line. What we're looking at right now is a command that is being run with the Salesforce CLI, so you can run this on any org. I want to remind you here that we are talking about the Salesforce CLI, not Salesforce DX. And what this means is that you can run this on your production org. You can run this on any org. You do not need to have the source format in your source code. There's nothing that ties a specific command to a scratch org or something like that. You can run this on any code. Now, what this does here is that it will run all your tests with the -c flag here, which retrieves code coverage, and we are using a -r human flag in command argument, sorry, and this means that we are retrieving the results in a human readable format. This runs all the tests, and you can see here the output of a command line. In the top section here, we can see the coverage for our two different Apex classes, account controller and contact controller. And we can see below the different tests. Of course, there can be a lot of those, but what is interesting here is the coverage here, and also really at the end of the command, the overall coverage. There are two different metrics here. The test run coverage, so this is for all the classes we ran, and also for the entire org. Two different things. Now, what is interesting here with this output here is that I've used the newest output format that is going to be coming in summer 20, and this is actually available right now, and we can get basically a bit more details in this output here by toggling a flag. So right now, if you don't have a pre-release org, if you're still in Spring 20, you can actually activate that, and when you run the command here to run the test, you'll see a warning which tells you that you can set an environment variable to get a preview of the summer 20 format. That's what I did. So I suggest that you try to set this environment variable and check out this new format, which is pretty convenient. So that's for Apex. Now, if we go and look at Lightning Web Components, with Lightning Web Components, we are using a tool called Jest. Jest is a JavaScript testing framework. It's not invented by Salesforce, but we've basically provided an extension to Jest so that it's able to test our JavaScript code and test our Lightning Web Components. And just like we had code coverage for with the Salesforce CLI, we have actually code coverage with Jest. And the command that I've written here is the one that is being used to generate this code coverage report here. Now, generally, you'll have it wrapped into a node configuration file. So the syntax may vary a bit because you're likely going to be writing an alias for this command. What is interesting here is the output of the report. The amount of information we have is a bit different compared to the Apex report. And what you want to be looking at is the first line. And specifically this particular indicator here, the percentage of code coverage for your entire project with all the lines here. So 76% is our global code coverage for Lightning Web Components here. Now, if you look down there are also some certain files which are not as much covered, specifically this one, the aura pub sub here, which has actually 0 tests. And what is interesting with this report here is that it gives you the lines which are not covered. Of course, for large files, this can mean a lot of lines, but that's a good indicator. So these are a good start. Using the CLI is really the bare minimum, but if you want to be testing something and measuring code coverage, you want to move to a smarter approach and use a bit more tooling. And I hope you are aware of the tools I'm going to talk about, and maybe not, but I hope you're going to be learning and trying those out soon. So there are two things I want to highlight. First, if you're using the recommended IDE, you're likely using VS Code. This is probably working also for other IDEs. But if you use Visual Studio Code, you can get actually a highlighter to get the Apex code coverage displayed visually on your Apex code. So you may remember the time when you were using the developer console and you had this feature available in the developer console. Now you can do exactly the same thing and highlight the lines that are covered by your tests or not covered. And here you can see in this example here in the screenshot here that most of my code is covered except for this specific function that I just added there, which is my untested method. And this here is in red because it's not covered by my tests. So that's pretty convenient. Generally, what I have here when I'm writing tests is that I have my windows split into two panes. Basically, I have generally on the left side, I have the actual class that I'm testing, so likely the contact controller. And on the right side, I generally have another window open. That's the test class. It's pretty convenient if you have a large monitor to have the two things open at the same time. You can try that by holding the tab here and dragging and dropping it on the side and on VS Code. This will actually allow you to split the screen in two and have the two views at the same time, which is very helpful when you have your test code and the code coverage displayed at the same time. Now, how do you activate code coverage? Code coverage is not activated by default in VS Code, so you have to actually go into the setup and preferences to activate it. Very quickly, you want to go into Code, Preferences, and Settings. Open the Settings view for Visual Studio Code, and you want to do a search for Apex coverage, or search the specific variable here, Salesforce DX, VS Code Core, retrieve test code coverage. And basically it's a checkbox that you want to set to true. By default, it's not checked, so you want to check that thing. Also, one thing that is worth mentioning is that there might be two preferences tab in your settings for VS Code. First, there is your workspace settings, and there's also your user settings. So you want to make sure that this checkbox is checked for which profile is more appropriate for you. Once you have done that, you'll need, of course, to rerun all your tests with code coverage. And at the end, you open an Apex class, and you have to go at the bottom of VS Code bar here, and you want to click on this icon here. It's looking at like 3 different parallel bars here, and when you click on it, there's going to be a nudge on those 3 little bars, which will toggle the code coverage highlighter. And that's pretty simple to set up, but it's also a game changer when you want to find out what is the code that you haven't tested. So that's a really good thing to try out. So let's do now the same thing for Jest, or for Lightning Web Components. Well, for Lightning Web Components, this is not shipped by default in VS Code, so you have to use also an extension. For Apex, we were using the Salesforce extensions for VS Code, and for Jest, we have to use something else. We have to use an extension which is specific to Jest. So you want to install this extension first, which is just called Jest. There are several extensions which have similar names, so you want to be careful to target the right one. This one has this little RTA VS Code -jest at the end, and that's the one you want to get. Now you install this, you toggle the highlighter with launching the command palette. So here I've just, for your convenience, written down the 2 shortcuts. So Control-Shift-P for Windows, or Command-Shift-P for Mac. This brings down basically a text search in the center of the screen. You just start typing Jest coverage, and you'll find this menu appearing on the list of commands, Jest toggle coverage overlay, and this will activate the overlay with the coverage. So here I've taken a file which is purposely not covered by any test, so you can see a lot of red here. So that's really something that is simple, activating the code coverage highlighter for both Apex and Lightning Web Components in VS Code. That's really something that will help you. Now, that's good, but it's not perfect. So you want to go on the next level, and you want to look for the long-term vision, which is, I would say, what professional teams are supposed to do. And when you work on deliverables that are going to be hitting production for a customer or something like that, you really want to aim for that. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you want to figure out is how can you automate code coverage with CI? Because running code coverage in your local environment, and I mean, from times to times, it's not good enough. You need to do that systematically each time the code changes. So to do that, of course, you're going to be relying on an automated system, which is your continuous environment, integration environment. And you want to use a code coverage tool for that. There are different options to do that, and I'm just going to give you an example with CodeCov, which is my current favorite because it's basically free for open source and very easy to set up on GitHub, but there are other alternatives to that, so I don't want to just do some sort of advertisement for them. And so regardless of the tool you choose, you want to be looking for a couple of really must-have features to do code coverage in an automated way. What you want to be looking for is something that is very simple and yet flexible to install in your CI environment. So you want to have the ability to configure it in a way that is adapted to your project. In particular, for Salesforce projects, we have a specific requirement that we need to have multi-language support. So basically, your CI system, or sorry, your code coverage system needs to be able to handle the fact that we'll be reporting code coverage for Apex, but also for Lightning Web Components. So that's something that is not necessarily integrated in all tools. And finally, something that I think is very important is to have some sort of reporting capability. Because looking at line numbers or just percentage it's very the minimum, but if you want to figure out at a glance the health of your project, you want a bit more reporting capabilities. So I'll just give you some examples for those key features using CodeCov, and you can probably figure out what other tool could fit your needs. So let's start first with easy and flexible CI setup. Recently, I gave a talk, a TrailLF session on using GitHub Actions. If you attended this, you probably remember that setting up GitHub Actions is pretty simple. You have to create a YAML file which describes your CI workflow, and such a file looks a bit like like what I've pasted here in this screenshot. This YAML file describes all the different steps that CI is going to be executing one after the other, basically. And CI is going to be running the test at some point. For example, here it's running Lightning Web Components test, and it's going to be running those tests with a code coverage flag. So in this particular instance here, I'm running npm run test unit coverage, which is an alias for the command that runs Jest with code coverage. Now this runs Jest tests, and it saves the code coverage results in a file, which is stored in a directory called /coverage in your project. And if you were to use CodeCov for your project, you would basically add another GitHub action from CodeCov, which is just CodeCov/CodeCov action, which will take the content of that coverage folder, analyze it, and upload it to codecov.io, which is their website. Now, with that, you do the same thing for Apex. So later on, you run the Apex test with the reporting flag. Note that here I have added another parameter to the command, which is basically storing the test results in /test/apex and waiting up to 20 minutes for the results of the tests, and running again another action to upload the code coverage to CodeCov. Now, what is interesting here is that I was able to set a flag here when I uploaded my code coverage. This is the same project, this is the same CI build, but I need to be able to differentiate whether this is a code coverage for Lightning Web Components or for Apex. And with CodeCov, we have the ability to have set up custom flags. So that can be useful for reporting, to have those setup flags. Now, the idea is that this action here, this workflow here is configured to run each time there's a push on the master branch. Now, this is something you want to do in your project. So whether you use GitHub Actions or another CI system, and whether you use CodeCov or another code coverage tool, but basically you want to run code coverage on your master branch or your develop branch all the time, each time the code changed. What is interesting also with CodeCov is that you can get a little badge here which shows the health of your project, or at least the status of code coverage for your particular project. And that's super easy to set up. So just to sum up on CodeCov, you basically have to add 8 lines and a bit more to get a badge here, and then you're done. That's all you need. You don't even need to open an account or anything. You just need to tell CodeCov about uploading your reports. So that's very simple. You should do it now if you have some open source projects to start with, and maybe if you have a private repository with some production or more private content, you can consider whether to use CodeCov or another tool. So that's the first key feature, easy setup. Then you want to make sure that your CI system, or your code coverage system, works with multiple languages. Again, I want to stress out the fact that you're likely going to be testing more than one language. You're going to be testing, of course, Apex. That's, I think, the bare minimum, because we have this requirement of 75% code coverage. But you're likely also going to be testing your user interface, and so that means testing with Lightning Web Components or even Aura. So you want to make sure that your tool supports that, and you want to make sure also that your tool is able to take all of this code coverage data, aggregate it so that you have a global overview, but also have the ability to, if you want, basically to split down the report and go and drill down into specifics. So whether you have like some holes in your coverage for Apex, you want to be able to drill down that part and not get the whole data view from Apex and Lightning Web Components. Finally, one of the things that is really important, I think, for a production project is having the ability to run some reporting. Getting the numbers at a given time is interesting, but what you need to look for is a trend. So you really need to be able to have some reports and also some visuals which will let you identify gaps in your code coverage. So for code cover, two main dashboards here, which are interesting, two reports. And the first one is the code coverage evolution. This tells you for a given duration what's the code coverage. Now you'll notice on this specific screenshot I have taken here that there was a little glitch here, and at some point we had 100% code coverage, which actually never happened. I think something went wrong there. But what is more interesting here is at the beginning here we had a lower code coverage, and when we updated this. And what is also very interesting is that this is actually counting for 6 months. So this is giving us the minimum code coverage for the last 6 months. So something that you want to monitor and look from time to time, and just checking that you never have code coverage which actually is lower than a given amount or is lowering. Now, on the other interesting side of things is the coverage sunburst. This is diagram which shows basically at the center the top level folders. So if you look at the center of the circle here, you're looking at your project, and the further away you go from the center, the lower you go in repositories. And basically on the outer rim here, you'll see the files themselves. So for example, here when we set up this thing for the sample applications, because here we're looking at Lightning Web Components recipes, by looking at this graph here, we were able to spot that we had made some mistakes, some very big mistakes actually. So nobody's perfect, of course. But if you look at the lower part of the circle here, this whole batch here was actually static resources. So we made a mistake. We were using a third-party library, and when we were running tests, code coverage wasn't ignoring those static resources. So we were actually calculating those extra lines there in code coverage, but we didn't own that third-party component, so we weren't really the ones that should be making the test for it. So that's something to remember. Look at this sunburst diagram and try to see where there are large chunks that are uncovered. So I think it's pretty interesting to explore. Now, there's also a bonus that you can get from code cover or maybe another tool. You can get some automated reports on pull requests, and I think that's a very valuable thing. We don't have that yet for all the sample applications on the Trailhead gallery, but we're going to put that soon. And the idea is that we can automate with some reports which shows us the delta in terms of code coverage that a PR will bring in. And that's basically something that lets us answer very easily a question: should we merge that PR or request extra tests? So this particular example was for a PR that added a new file, which is error panel here. And this error file was actually absolutely entirely covered. So it was 100% code coverage. So that's something you can basically accept safely. But sometimes you can probably have people which will contribute code or modify other files that is going to be something that is going to be damaging your code coverage. And so with that specific report, you can see the impact of a given PR at a glance. Because otherwise, if you don't have this kind of report, you're going to have a hard time to figure out whether the code was tested or not. So that's something I recommend that you try. Automating a few things like that can really save you a lot of time and boost your project quality. Now, we've talked a lot about tooling, and I just want to step out of tooling and just come back to some more general concepts. And I want to be talking about best practices for Apex and Lightweight components. So that's not really a best practice. You already know that the code coverage requirement for Apex is 75%, but some of you may not know one thing. This code coverage is super important, but it's also missing some key things. We have this requirement of quantity, but we don't have a requirement of quality for the testing. And there are two things at least that you should add in your codes, in your tests, That's bulk testing, so checking out for limits, and also security tests. What I mean by that is just making sure that if someone doesn't have the permission to access a given record, maybe because it's a profile issue, or maybe because it's a field level security, something like that, this is something that is not included in the code coverage, but it's also a likely source of error and something you should test for. So remember to do these extra things, and code coverage will not tell you if you're missing those key things. So keep in mind that. Now for Lightning Web Components, there's strictly no requirement, but I think it is the responsibility of developers to make sure that they ship something in production that is safe and will work. And there are also some things that are not included in code coverage for Lightning Web Components. And something actually also very important, well, code coverage does not check for dynamic template. What I mean by that is that if you have conditional rendering or iterations, this is not included in the code coverage checks. So it's your job when you're writing your test to make sure that when you set some variables, that the template is affected or re-rendered correctly. That's something you really want to keep in mind, because the tests for Lightning Web Components will basically show whether you have covered your JavaScript code, but it's not something that is going to show automatically HTML updates for your template. Of course, you can do that really easily. If you have the ability to check out my other tried live session on Lightning Web Components testing, you can get started very easily. And I've already explained that, but it's really key to remember that covering just the JavaScript code is not enough. You also need to cover the template. And one thing that we've learned the hard way when we were working on the sample applications is that you should ignore your static resources with code coverage, because you don't want to, for example, to cover D3 like we did for Lightning Web Components recipes. That's something really important. So if you're using some third-party code and you have a DX project, you want to make sure that you're not including those static resources. And the solution is pretty simple. I can give you the solution for codecov.io. It's just a matter of writing an ignore file that will tell codecov not to look at any JavaScript files that are located under static resources. That's as simple as that, but it's something that impacts greatly your code coverage because, of course, third-party libraries generally have a lot of lines there. So it's not your job to test those third-party libraries. Finally, one of the key things that you want to be working on, and it's not always easy, it's making sure you monitor your code coverage evolution on the long run. Because you can probably start with a first version of your project with a good code coverage, but you'll be likely modifying your code, adding features, updating things, and as you touch your code and modify as it lives. And if you're not careful enough, you might compromise on testing because you want to rush this feature out. You have a deadline. It's super hard to maybe write the few extra tests that you would need, and that will damage your code coverage because the more code you add that is not tested, the lower your code coverage is. So make sure you don't compromise on quality versus quantity, or just don't rush things out. That's my recommendation. I know it's not always easy, but it's good to remember that you should be monitoring your code coverage over time. And if you have lowered your code coverage, you should allow yourself some extra time to compensate for that, because likely the next time you have to ship something into production, you will only things will only get worse. So don't wait to create some code coverage depth before moving on. Now it's time for me to conclude. I think I've convinced you that code coverage is basically used to find untested code, but it's not something that is meant as a quality target. We do require 75% code coverage for Apex, but you should not stop at just looking at this number. You should also make sure that you test for the right things. And to help you do that, make sure you use all the tools. So remember the three level of tools. You have the command line interfaces, but you also have the highlighters in Visual Studio Code and continuous integration tools. Try to avoid using developer console. At some point it will go away, so make sure you use the modern tools first, whether it is VS Code or any other IDE, use those. And yeah, finally, just like I said, make sure you follow your code coverage evolution during the project life cycle. Don't run a report every month or every year. Make sure you do that each time the code changes and you're able to react quickly to those changes. Well, with that, I'm going to leave you to a couple of resources. If you want to look for best practices for code coverage, there are a lot of them written in the Apex developer guide. All you have to do is search for code coverage in there, and you'll find code coverage best practices. And we did a lot of work on testing, and you can find a lot of these of the examples and configuration for CodeCov and for testing in the sample apps. So that's trello.salesforce.com/sample gallery. And you'll want to be looking at Lightning Web Components recipes, because that's, I think, the best project to look for testing and code coverage reporting. Now, if you want to set up code coverage highlighter in Visual Studio Code, I want to point you out to two documentation resources. First one is the Apex documentation for VS Code. The URL is a bit long, so I'll let you look at it. You can watch the recording if this was too fast for you, but it's kind of hidden. I mean, it's not hidden, but it's hard to find. So developer.salesforce.com/tool/vscode/en/apex/testing. This will tell you the different steps on how you can toggle that little setting to retrieve code coverage and activate the highlighter for the Apex extension for Visual Studio Code. That's something I wasn't using for a long time, and I rediscovered, and it's really a valuable tool. So make sure you take that time to read this little documentation and activate it. The other link I want to provide you with is the Lightning Web Components extension. Actually, no, it's the Jest extension for testing Lightning Web Components. And you want to remember the specific name, Orta VS Code Jest. This is something which will let you highlight the Lightning Web Components test. Finally, if you want even more resources, I've given two similar sessions on Trello Live a couple of weeks ago. The first one was how to test Lightning Web Components. So I was talking extensively on the different approaches, the tools, and the patterns you can use to test Lightning Web Components. And the second session, which is also related to this one, is how you can set up continuous integration with GitHub Actions. I think this will go very well with code coverage, because code coverage should be part of your CI system. That's it. Thank you again for listening. I'm going to be looking at questions in the chat. Thank you again. Have a great day.